Hello again, I'm Stephen Bauman, and this is going to be the second part in my series about Bargue drawings. The last video I talked about maybe some of the more basic ideas that we have in that field of study, and in this one I'm going to get into some of the intermediate drawings that students will copy in order to attain a different set of kind of skills that they can use to improve their own work. These intermediate drawings in particular are some of the ones that I really enjoy. So some of my favorite lithographs from the Bargue series are actually going to be in this second video. The final video is going to be about the advanced projects, in particular the Belvedere torso from the front and from the back. If you're familiar with that Bargue plate, then you know what I'm talking about, but if not, it's a really big, beautiful drawing, and I'm going to try and take an entire episode and unpack its concepts so that we can get into why that's so interesting. But right now, we're going to deal with a lot of portraits, and also in this intermediate phase, the Bargue plates tend towards involving a lot more halftone value, so turning a lot more form in a really much more sophisticated way than maybe what the very early drawings were doing. And if you're watching this and you have no idea what a Bargue drawing is, please go back to the previous video and get a little primer on what they are and where they come from, and then meet me back here and we can dive into these drawings that are a little bit more complex and a little bit more interesting, frankly. So the first drawing that I've got here is a profile. And this one, when I've seen this copied, usually it's probably about 10 inches from top to bottom, so maybe in centimeters that's about 20 centimeters. It's maybe a head that is probably 3/4 life size. So this is, I'm pretty sure, the head of Brutus. And each one of these Bargue plates really has its own kind of story. Every one of these is a sculpture from antiquity, and that sculpture, of course, has some kind of story behind it. I take that back. Not all of them are actually from antiquity. One of the ones I'm going to talk about today is actually a death mask, which if you've ever studied plaster cast, you'll be pretty familiar with death masks from Beethoven. But let's talk about Brutus here for a minute. And we can see on the left-hand side, once again, this same concept of how to kind of take very complex situations and features like, for instance, the shape of the eye socket, and boil that down into really, really kind of basic diagrammatic shapes. Now, those shapes, of course, like I talked about in the last episode, empower you to kind of take proportional measurements and observations. And the simpler they are, the more flexible they are. So we see Bargue here taking an even more complex subject, like this one, which is full of rippling detail throughout the hair and the beard, and boiling it down to its most kind of essential features. You can see that he's taken, and this is fascinating here, look at all of the information running along this hairline. Wow, it couldn't be more filled with like shapes and design and all of this fluidity and interesting stuff. Here, what do we have? Maybe 3 line segments. And what he's doing essentially is trying to look at, instead of all of the kind of superficial characteristics of the hair, what he's trying to do is look at how we can create a proportional boundary. Boiling all of that down to those 2 line segments, what that allows him to do actually is to look at the distance or width overall in between the front and back of the head. And the same thing can happen down here. Each time that he's making a line segment, he's planning eventually to kind of create a proportional boundary that will allow him to kind of take a measurement either through sight size or through comparative measurements. Or in the case of these Bargue drawings, you will be able to, in fact, since you're going to be drawing at the exact same size as he is, you'd be able to actually take a physical measurement with calipers or something and actually bring that over to your drawing and kind of check to see whether you got it right or not. I put that mark in the wrong place. Now, the next thing that we start to get with this drawing in particular is that we start to get more sophisticated shapes to the shadows, right? So if we have the world kind of split up into these kind of 2 groups, right, that we have, let's say we have our kind of conceptual sphere here, and I'm going to make a perfect circle for that. And then we have a nice kind of soft shadow edge because the light is kind of coming from the left and lighting this sphere. What we're left with is this kind of binary world, right? Shadow shape, light shape. And if we're in the light shape, of course, it means one thing. If we're in the shadow shape, it's going to mean another thing. And that's the kind of basic premise that I want to use to look at this drawing right now. So let's go ahead and kind of look here at this shadow shape of the eye socket, right? Or once you determine that you're organizing the world into shadow shapes and light shapes, we can start to talk about the characteristics of those shapes. So shape design relies on recognition. And in these Bargue drawings in particular, he's asking you to be really quite abstract in terms of the way you think about shapes. So one of the really interesting things that you can do is actually start to kind of name your shapes. So if you and I'm just going to like take this shape around the eye socket here, and I'm going to really emblazon the edge of it. I'm going to really make that edge a super hard edge. And I'm going to kind of circle it here so we understand exactly what I'm talking about. This shape, and this is really hilarious, I remember a teacher of mine he was critiquing a student who was actually working next to me at the academy, right? It wasn't even my drawing, but I was overhearing his critique. And the teacher referred to this shape as being like a wonky tiger. So you can almost see, right, that there's like, if there was like an eye here, and that if you had like some, teeth coming out here and here, that you could see almost like a tiger shape, right? Now, while that's in itself is, of course, like really funny, what we're doing here, we're talking about an ability to naively recognize the differences in between our subject and our drawing, right? So in the real world, right, instead of in the Bargue world, when we're drawing a portrait, we have likeness. And our ability to kind of recognize and memorize likeness is really quite profound. But when we're drawing, we need to kind of re-stimulate that part of our brain. So in the early stages of a drawing, when an eye socket, of course, doesn't even really look like anything yet, what we can start to do is kind of name those shapes. We can look for the shape of like a wonky tiger, and that recognition and that name will really help us to kind of better recognize that shape and therefore compare it for the sake of correction. The next drawing that I'm going to talk about is one of the ones that it's done so many times. And in fact, actually looking at the description here, this one then is Brutus. So I take it back. Talking about the previous one, I said I thought it might have been Brutus. In fact, maybe it was. Who knows? But suffice to say, in this drawing for sure, we're dealing with Brutus. Now, another thing that's happening is the shapes of the shadows here are starting to become a little bit more sophisticated, right? So let's take a look at what we mean by sophisticated and what we mean by simplified. If we look at a contour line like this one, right, here on the neck, and we see what Charles Bargue is viewing as a kind of simplified version of it, that can help us understand from just a pure vocabulary definition standpoint what we mean by simplified. So here on this right-hand side, we have several different angle breaks and a line that has quite a subtle gesture. Here on the left, we've taken those subtle gestures and complex angle breaks and turned them into two line segments with a single meeting. So by removing extra angle breaks and nuance to the gesture of something, we've simplified it, right? So we're removing information. We're stripping away down to something a little bit more essential and a little bit more utilitarian. So then when we think about a shape like this one, which is defining the light that is hitting the planes of the cheek and the planes of the eyelids and a little bit the forms within the eye socket that represent the eye projecting out from the eye socket, these are all simplified into a single shape here with quite hard edges, and that will be very familiar to what you saw when we were talking about the first series of Bargues, which were really kept super simple without a lot of halftone. Here in this drawing on the right, when we have that halftone inserted, you can see what happens to the edges or boundaries of that shape. They're no longer the hard and kind of crisp boundaries that we noticed in the first set of Bargues that we were talking about. These ones are soft and are full of kind of nuance and complexity. And so we've kind of leveled up in terms of the amount of detail and sophistication in the drawing that we're trying to copy. And so when you take a look at Bargues, it's great, by the way, to look at the ones that you really think are interesting and the most dynamic, but a lot of the ideas that you're going to need to confront the more complex drawings are actually tied up in the earlier, much more simple drawings. So in this way, they offer a really great sense of linear progression through your drawing education. Now, this one is in fact really well known, and if you're familiar with Bargue plates at all, this is probably one of the ones that you have seen. This one in particular is a death mask, and I've heard it referred to as the Girl of the Seine, which is that river that I think runs through Paris. Now, this death mask is really interesting, and this sculpture is really interesting, partly because we actually have available to us this actual sculpture. It is a plaster cast that is available really in a lot of places, and I've seen it at a lot of ateliers, certainly at the Florence Academy of Art where I was teaching. We had several copies of this. So what you can do is actually compare what Charles Bargue has done in the simplification of this to the kind of real reality of the cast itself, which is really fascinating to do. So you can see even further in detail the differences and changes that he's made, the simplifications that he's made, because these are really what make up our understanding of his approach, right? How to understand how Charles Bargue would simplify things. It's fascinating. So here we can see, and it's a really great example, just how subtle these drawings have become by this point. What's really interesting here also is something called the flow of light, which is to say that if we are looking at the surface of the form here and running our eye across that surface, we're not really stopped until we reach this shadow edge. which is to say a lot of the values that we find, like the transition between the forehead and the glabella, really is a soft transition, and there's not necessarily a hard, definitive boundary in between them. So soft edges in between halftones here, hard boundary between shadow and light here. This becomes even more subtle and more ambiguous as we run over the forms of the brow ridge and the eyelid in this eye that's on the left-hand side. It's probably pretty hard to see on a screen here, but when you look at this plate in person, the thing that you'll notice is that the shadow edge is constrained to this section here within the upper inner corner of the eye socket, to the outer edge of the brow ridge and the lower left-hand side of the eyelid, and then of course underneath the eyelid and down to the tear duct. But all the way through here, the light is really allowed to flow and touch the form, and the edges are really rather soft. So the place that Charles Bargue is taking you to here is giving you a super complex visual impression and asking you to separate those visual phenomenon into their constituent parts. So he wants you to find the shadow shape, he wants you to find the dark halftones, he wants you to understand the flow of light running through this area. And by offering you a very complex problem in this intermediate stage, he's ensured that you're going to confront this problem in a way that is much more difficult for you to simplify than it was in the early stages of your drawing education when you were working on the Bargues from the last video I made. It should also be noted here how much the halftone has developed in this. If you remember the previous drawings where the halftones were almost non-existent, here we have entire passages of the face that are filled with halftone value. All of these little halftone values, and it's fascinating. When you get to look at this drawing up close in person, when you get to look at the lithograph, the actual print itself, what you see is that all of these halftones have soft but specific boundaries that help to define the planes and turn the form. There's so much sophistication in this drawing, and he's showing it to you in the most stripped down way possible. Really, it's amazing. Moving on to the next plate, we have Homer. This is really one of my most favorite Bargues. The amount of expression and detail in that face is just so beautiful, and when you combine that with the slightly stylized vision of his hair from this kind of classical era sculpture, I just think it's so beautifully rendered and beautifully designed. You can almost look at areas like this and it becomes like a kind of a decorative sculpture. You could see forms like this on top of a Corinthian column or something. But what I want to point out here is really still how committed he is to this conceptual vision of reality. If we look at this eye socket, one of the things that we notice is that the shadow shape could not be more crystal clear. In fact, though the whole drawing itself is really rather convincing, I would say that actually this area in particular becomes almost very abstract. Like, I'm sure that we could look at that sculpture and that area would look very different from that. The edges would be less pristine and less crisp in relationship to each other. The boundary between shadow and light would be less pronounced. And then the way that all of the halftones seem to stop just short of being a shadow. It's that level of organization and specificity that actually renders so much to the student in terms of informing your ability to organize visual phenomenon. Also, this litho in particular really presents such a spectacular problem to students because you have areas like this where it is really full of detail. And while they're trying to organize the world into these binary shadow shape, light shape situations, Charles comes in and starts to put more information inside the shadow. If you remember from my initial discussion about shadow shape, light shape, one of the lessons that he was trying to teach you in the earlier drawings was that shadow is atmosphere and light is form. Here, we're not necessarily turning that on its head, but what he's doing is trying to show you that the shadow doesn't have to be completely flat, that if necessity dictates, we can put value information inside the shadow, transitional values inside the shadow, and still make a drawing that holds together well. And this is an area as well in which one particular tool comes to bear. I want you to take a look at this sculpture of Homer here on the right, and look at this area in particular. First, I want you to have your eyes wide open, like open them as wide as you can. And look for all the value variation that you can inside of this shadow. Look for all the kind of halftone shapes that differentiate themselves from the darkest shadow. Now let's perform the second part of this experiment. I want you to squint down till you're almost looking through your eyelashes at this area of the drawing. While you're looking at this with your eyes super squinted down, what you cease to see really is much differentiation in between the dark values here. It has returned to that state of shadow being atmosphere, leaving the light to form the greater part of the impression. So squinting down eventually becomes a tool that we can use to help recognize the boundaries of shape in between dark and light. Let's look at another shape just for fun. This one in particular here is also filled with various areas of reflected light. Once again, when we squint down and we look at that shape, what you notice much more than that reflected light and variation inside the shadow is actually how the rest of the shadow really bonds together into almost a single value shape. So we'll open our eyes back up again, super wide, and we see once again all that reflected light. So this drawing creates a kind of case-in point for shadow is atmosphere and light is form. However, there can be life inside the shadow. Form doesn't stop at the shadow edge. It just is organized and prioritized downwards, especially in the early phases of a drawing when everything is super simplified. So that's going to take us to the end of the video for today. The things that I want you to remember and pick out from this intermediate section in the Bargue drawing series is how value variation, both within the light shape and the shadow shape, comes into being in this intermediate section. In the previous series of drawings, it almost didn't have any place to be whatsoever. The lights were totally unified, the shadows were totally unified. In the intermediate phase, we have a little bit of life inside the shadows and a whole lot of halftone within the light shape, which is of course totally necessary to turn the form. When we get to the next video and I'm talking about the advanced Bargues, you're going to see that those concepts which were expressed in the early part of the series almost seem like they're turned on their head. This of course is not the case at all. It's simply that Charles Bargue's allusions to the infinite complexity that we find in visual phenomenon taken from nature don't have to be completely unified away. We can utilize them, we can draw form in a lot of different lighting situations. But I want to bring that back for a brief moment and talk about simplification. If we look at these intermediate drawings and those advanced drawings I'm going to talk about in the next video, the question could be asked, well, why don't we just draw it the way that it is right then? And of course, that's possible to do. However, these drawings are really designed to be didactic. They're meant to teach you something, they're meant to communicate a concept. So by stripping away all of that excess information, he was able to better illustrate to you the idea of shape design and the idea of shadow shape and light shape duality. And while that simplification may make the early drawings look a little bit bland to some people's taste, when looked at as a learning exercise, they're really, really excellent. Thank you so much for watching today, and if you like the content on this channel, please remember to like and subscribe. And if you're interested in more in-depth tutorials about portrait drawing and portrait painting, you can always visit my Patreon page. The link is right up here.